I never thought I would leave like this, with my heart torn between duty and love. The clock read 5:45 when I finished packing my suitcase. Gabriel was still asleep, his golden hair spread across the pillow. He had the habit of hugging the stuffed rabbit Ricardo gave him on his last birthday. Seeing that little body so peaceful made my chest tighten. I knew he hated goodbyes, so I chose not to wake him. But that didn't make my departure any less bitter. In the kitchen, Ricardo's coffee had already gone cold in his cup. He was leaning against the counter, staring at his phone with a tired expression. "Will you be okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Ricardo lifted his eyes and gave me a small smile, but something about him felt different. Perhaps it was the exhaustion or the weight of being left alone with Gabriel and my mother-in-law. Irene was a case of her own. "Of course, Helena. Everything will be fine. It's just a month, right?" He tried to sound confident, but the hesitation in his voice hit me. "I know it's a lot for you, but Gabriel loves being with you. And Irene helps, doesn't she?" He didn't reply. He just nodded, his gaze returning to the phone. Irene appeared in the living room as if she had synchronized with my thoughts. Always impeccable, her face was marked by time, but her eyes carried a sharpness I could never overlook. "Leaving already, Helena?" she said, adjusting the beige sweater that seemed to be her personal uniform. "Don't worry, Ricardo and I will take good care of Gabriel. After all, it's the least we can do while you work so hard." There was something about her words that always felt laced with venom. She spoke as if my work was a selfish choice rather than a necessity to support the family. I swallowed hard, as I had done for years. It wasn't worth arguing. "Thank you, Irene. I know Gabriel is in good hands," I lied. She responded with a smile that never reached her eyes. Before leaving, I stopped by Gabriel's room one last time. The sun was beginning to rise, and the golden morning light illuminated his angelic face. I leaned in to kiss his forehead, inhaling the scent of the children's shampoo he loved. "I'll be back soon, my love," I whispered. He stirred slightly but kept sleeping. When I closed the front door, I felt a pang in my chest, an almost physical sensation that I was leaving something important behind. I started the car, trying to ignore the feeling. It was just a month. Ricardo was a good father, and Irene, well, she was the grandmother. They would know how to take care of Gabriel. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. The airport was crowded as always, but this time, the people around me felt more distant, indistinct blurs in a scene that didn't make sense. My heart beat faster with every step toward the departure gate. Something was wrong. A premonition that had followed me since my last call with Ricardo. He seemed off. It wasn't just exhaustion. There was a weight in his voice that I couldn't decipher. As soon as I stepped through the automatic doors, I spotted Ricardo leaning against our car. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped. He didn't run to hug me as usual, didn't smile when he saw me. Next to him, Irene held a handkerchief, her eyes seemingly red. But something about her face, something was wrong. "Ricardo?" My voice came out louder than I expected. He lifted his head slowly, as if the mere movement was painful. When our eyes met, I felt the ground disappear beneath me. He was crying. "Helena," he began, but his voice broke. He covered his face with his hand, rubbing his eyes. "What happened? Where's Gabriel?" My words tumbled out, almost incoherent. The air around me felt thinner, and my mind raced to the worst-case scenario, even as I tried to push it away. It was Irene who spoke first. "Oh, Helena. It all happened so quickly." Her voice trembled, but it sounded theatrical. I knew how to recognize genuine emotion, and this wasn't it. She clutched the handkerchief tightly, as if rehearsing a scene. Ricardo, on the other hand, looked shattered. He tried to speak again, but sobbed. That's when I realized, whatever it was devastating. "Ricardo, tell me, where is our son?" My voice trembled, now rising into a shout. I needed to hear the words, even if they tore me apart. He finally found the strength. "Helena, Gabriel is dead." Those words exploded in my head, echoing like an incessant siren. Gabriel is dead. My Gabriel. My boy full of life, with his endless questions and contagious laughter. No, it couldn't be true. No. I shook my head, stepping back. No, this can't be true. You must be mistaken. He was fine when I left. He was fine. It was so sudden, Ricardo continued, his voice choked. He started feeling unwell. We tried everything, but we couldn't save him. My mind spun, refusing to accept it. Why? How? What happened? The doctors said it was food poisoning, Irene replied, pressing the handkerchief against her nose. A tragedy. Something about the way she said those words made my stomach churn. A tragedy? There was no real pain in her voice, only a rehearsed tone. I want to see my son, I demanded. Ricardo hesitated. Helena, are you sure? It's not something you... I want to see my son, I interrupted, my voice now filled with a mix of anger and desperation. Without further words, we got into the car. Ricardo drove in silence while I clung to the hope that this was all a nightmare, something that would disappear as soon as I woke up. But Ricardo's silence and Irene's constantly averted gaze told me otherwise. When we arrived at the morgue, the cold, chemical smell of the place hit me. My body trembled, and my breathing was shallow. An attendant guided us down a hallway that felt far too long, to a room where a stretcher was covered with a white sheet. Helena, you don't have to do this, Ricardo murmured, his hand on my shoulder. I have to. My voice was firm, even though my body was on the verge of collapse. With trembling hands, I pulled down the sheet, revealing Gabriel's face. There he was, motionless, pale, but still my boy. I touched his cold cheek, feeling my soul shatter. Then something caught my attention. For a brief moment, a flicker out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw his chest move. A slight contraction, so small it could have been my imagination. But it wasn't. He's breathing, I screamed. Helena, no. Ricardo tried to stop me. Look, he's breathing. He's alive. The staff came running, but at first, no one believed me. It was only when one of them touched Gabriel's body that the chaos began. The tests confirmed it. He still had a pulse. My son was alive. As they rushed him for emergency care, a new wave of emotions hit me. Relief, despair, but also an unsettling certainty. This wasn't an accident. Something had happened, and I would find out what it was. I felt like my heart was caught in a current, oscillating between despair and a frantic hope that I dared not let fully grow. The image of the doctors rushing Gabriel into the emergency room still danced in my mind. He was alive. Alive. I repeated it to myself like a prayer or a spell, something that could fend off any other outcome. Ricardo stood beside me, pale and trembling. He said nothing, and his silence made every second drag on even more. I tried to stay calm as we waited for news, but my mind wouldn't stop. How was this possible? He had been in a morgue, covered by a sheet, declared dead. And now, here we were, on the verge of a revelation I both feared and craved. Helena, Ricardo began, breaking the silence. His voice was hesitant, almost a whisper. How did this happen? How was he dead and now he isn't? I didn't respond immediately. His question echoed my own, but there were no answers. Instead, I looked at him, searching for something, anything, in his expression that might tell me he also felt something was wrong. He seemed as lost as I was, but there was one detail that deeply unsettled me. Ricardo believed what he had been told. He accepted Gabriel's death without questioning it. I didn't. Before I could respond, Irene entered the waiting room. I hadn't even noticed that she wasn't with us since we left the morgue. Now, there she was, as impeccable as ever. but with an air of discomfort I couldn't ignore. "How is he?" she asked, her voice filled with a false warmth that made me clench my fists. "He's alive," I replied, looking directly into her eyes. I wanted to see her reaction. And she reacted, but not the way I expected. For a brief second, a genuine expression of surprise crossed her face before it was quickly replaced with relief. But it wasn't real relief. It was the kind of emotion someone shows when they're trying to convince others they're happy. "Oh, thank God. What a miracle," she said with the theatrical tone I was beginning to recognize. A knot formed in my stomach. Irene was lying, and at that moment I knew. She knew something. Before I could confront her, the door to the room opened, and a doctor entered. His expression was serious but not dire. It gave me a spark of courage. "Gabriel is in critical condition," he began, "but he's alive. He's breathing with the help of machines and has been placed in a medically induced coma to stabilize his body. We're still trying to understand how this was possible, given the circumstances." "What caused this?" I asked, my voice firmer than I felt inside. The doctor hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words. "We're still waiting on test results, but preliminarily we've found traces of a toxic substance in his system, something ingested." My heart stopped. Toxic substance? This wasn't an accident. It couldn't be. "Are you saying he was poisoned?" My voice came out louder than I intended. "We can't confirm that yet," the doctor replied, avoiding eye contact. I turned to Ricardo, seeking support, but he looked stunned, unable to process what he was hearing. Meanwhile, Irene, in the background, was twisting her handkerchief compulsively. When her eyes met mine, she froze for a moment. And that was enough. There was my confirmation. Not in words, but in her silence. In that moment, a storm began to form within me. My son was fighting for his life, and someone had put him in this position. And though I didn't yet know how or why, one thing was certain. Irene had something to do with it. I vowed to myself that I would uncover the truth and, no matter the cost, protect Gabriel from any threat, even if it came from within our own family. The hospital was quiet, except for the monotonous beeping of monitors in the ICU. I sat next to Gabriel, holding his small hand as he lay motionless, breathing with the help of machines. Each rise and fall of his chest filled me with renewed hope, but also with seething anger. It wasn't just the fear of losing my son. It was the certainty that someone had done this to him. The door behind me opened, and Ricardo entered slowly. He carried that same lost expression. But there was something else. Determination. Since our conversation the previous night, he seemed to finally grasp what I had known for days. Irene had something to hide. "Helena," he began, pulling up a chair to sit beside me. "I spoke to the doctors. They confirmed the presence of arsenic in Gabriel's system. There's no doubt. It was poisoning." The official confirmation hit me like a punch, even though I already knew. I felt my muscles tense. "And now you believe me? Now you believe this wasn't an accident?" He sighed, covering his face with his hands. I didn't want to accept that my mother could be capable of something like this. But you're right. Her behavior, the things she said when Gabriel started feeling sick. It all makes sense now. I watched him for a moment, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Ricardo was a good man, but he had always been blind when it came to his mother. "We need to confront her," I declared. "Now." He nodded. For the first time, we were on the same page. We found Irene in the hospital corridor, sitting in one of the chairs with the same handkerchief that had become a permanent accessory since this tragedy began. When we approached, she looked up, and for the first time, I noticed a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. "Ricardo, Helena, how is Gabriel?" she asked, her voice attempting to sound maternal. Ricardo didn't answer immediately. He crossed his arms, took a deep breath, and finally said, "Do you know what the doctors found, Mother?" Irene blinked, feigning confusion. "No. What is it?" "Arsenic," he said bluntly. "They found arsenic in Gabriel's body. This wasn't an accident. And I want you to tell me right now, what did you do?" She shrank back in her chair, her eyes widening. "How dare you accuse me of something so horrible?" she protested, but her voice cracked. "Don't lie to me!" Ricardo raised his voice, something I had never seen before. "Gabriel told us. He said you forced him to eat a sweet even when he said he didn't want to. What was in that sweet, Mother?" The silence that followed was deafening. Irene clutched the handkerchief tightly, her lips trembling. Finally, she let out a nervous, almost hysterical laugh. "You don't understand," she said, looking at me with disdain. "He is your priority, Helena. He always has been. My own son barely looks at me because he's so busy taking care of your perfect little family." "So you tried to kill my son out of jealousy?" My voice was sharp, and I leaned toward her, feeling a rage I never knew I possessed. "How dare you?" Irene stood, her eyes blazing. "You took my son away from me," she shouted. "All I wanted was to restore the balance. A mistake, maybe, but it wasn't supposed to go this far." Ricardo seemed to be in shock, but he didn't back down. "You tried to kill my son. You put the life of an innocent child at risk out of pure selfishness." Irene didn't deny it. There was no remorse in her expression, only a cold stubbornness as if she were trying to justify the unjustifiable. Ricardo took a step back, his fists clenched. "I'm going to the police, and I'll make sure you pay for what you've done." "Ricardo, you wouldn't do that to your own mother." "You're not the mother I once knew," he replied, his voice now low but heavy with resolve. She tried to argue, but I heard none of it. Everything blurred as I held onto Ricardo's arm, supporting him to do what needed to be done. Deep down, I felt something close to relief. Justice was on its way, and I would do whatever it took to protect Gabriel, no matter the cost. The house felt different now. It wasn't the silence that bothered me, but the void left by the turmoil of the past days. I was sitting in Gabriel's room, looking at the carefully organized toys on the shelf, their bright colors contrasting with the heaviness in my chest. He was still in the hospital, recovering. The doctors said his strength was a miracle, that children have a surprising resilience. I clung to that because it was the only thing that made sense. Ricardo was in the living room, talking to the lawyer we had hired to handle the case. Irene had been arrested 2 days earlier. Ricardo kept his word and went to the police with the evidence provided by the doctors and the confession she tried to deny, but that he had recorded during the confrontation. I could still hear her cold, calculated voice echoing in my mind. "It was a mistake, but you would never understand." No, I would never understand. And frankly, I didn't want to. The consequences were swift. Irene was formally charged with attempted murder, and it didn't take long for the media to uncover the case. The headlines were as brutal as the reality. Grandmother tries to poison grandson out of jealousy toward mother. Ricardo was devastated. Despite all his anger, she was still his mother. But he knew there was no turning back. He chose to protect Gabriel. He chose our family. I, on the other hand, felt a mix of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. Anger, yes, but also relief. The danger was gone. And more than anything, a fierce determination took hold of me. I would rebuild our lives. When Gabriel finally woke up, I was by his side, holding his hand. He looked fragile, but his eyes, when they opened, were full of life. "Mommy," he said, his voice soft and raspy. I held back my tears. "I'm here, my love. I'll always be here." He didn't ask about Irene, and I didn't mention her. The only thing that mattered was that he was alive and safe. In the days that followed, he began to regain his strength, and every laugh, every smile, felt like another piece being restored in the puzzle of our lives. In court, Irene remained impassive throughout most of the proceedings. She showed no remorse and made no effort to defend herself. Her assigned lawyer argued that her age and mental state should be taken into account, but the judge was firm. The sentence was clear: enough years to ensure she would never come near Gabriel again. Ricardo didn't visit her after the arrest. He said he needed time, maybe even distance. But one day, while we were at the hospital, he looked at me and said, "I don't forgive her, Helena. But that doesn't mean I won't miss the mother I thought I had." I held his hand and said nothing. Some wounds only time could heal. When we finally returned home, we decided to start over. It was more than a choice, it was a necessity. We rearranged the furniture, painted the walls in different colors, as if that could erase the shadows Irene had left behind. And, in a way, it worked. Gabriel returned to school after a few weeks. He still had occasional nightmares, and so did I. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, reliving the moment at the morgue. But when I went to his room and saw him sleeping peacefully, the fear lessened. He was there. He was alive. As for Ricardo and me, our relationship changed. What we went through brought us closer in ways I never thought possible. It wasn't just love. It was a solid partnership forged in adversity. He started therapy to deal with the weight of his mother's betrayal, and I joined him for some sessions. We discovered strengths in each other we had never realized before. Today, as I write this, Gabriel is playing in the yard, his laughter echoing through the garden. Ricardo is in the kitchen, preparing dinner, something he's been doing more often since everything happened. I still think about Irene sometimes, not with hatred, but with a bitter curiosity. What drove her to do what she did? Would things have been different if she had sought help? These questions have no answers, and perhaps they never will. But what I do know, with absolute certainty, is that our family survived. We're not the same as before, and maybe that's a good thing. We're stronger, more aware, more grateful. And above all, we're together. And that's what truly matters.